Good morning and welcome to the very first episode of Taking It Further. My name's Keith and I'm the minister at Comberton Baptist Church. These Taking It Further videos are designed to sit alongside our normal Sunday teaching programme, and when we come across something that we think would be worthwhile sharing but we can't fit into our Sunday morning programme, we're going to create these additional videos, taking it further. And then if you want to take it further, you can find the videos and watch them and learn some more. This first video is designed to go alongside the service from Sunday the 13th of September 2020, when we started a new teaching series in the book of 2 Kings. We've been each autumn we've been working our way through the Old Testament, and so this is a recap of the story of the Old Testament from Genesis chapter 1 through to the end of 2 Kings, and we might go a little bit further. The Old Testament can seem to be, or the whole Bible can seem to be, very daunting. When you look at it, it's a very big book. It's not immediately obvious how the whole thing fits together. If you look into, if you've got your Bible with you, if you have a look in the contents page, you'll see that there are 66 separate books, and it's not, as I say, it's not immediately obvious that the whole thing is a single story, an overarching story that goes right from Genesis chapter 1 through to the end of Revelation. It can all seem a bit disjointed. The Bible is divided into two: the Old Testament and the New Testament, and a common way of thinking about the divisions in the Old Testament are that the first 5 books, sometimes these are called the law, sometimes these are called the Pentateuch. The first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. You then have a section of what we might refer to as historical books, so Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah and Esther. And then we come into poetry or writings, so Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. And then we have the prophets. So the rest of the books are prophets. Sometimes these are called the major prophets and the minor prophets, simply on the length of the book. And they're organised in our Old Testament in order of size, so from biggest to smallest. And so Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel and Daniel are often referred to as the major prophets simply because they're longer, and then Hosea through to Malachi are the minor prophets. Jesus and the disciples, when they talk about the scriptures, they are obviously only referring to the Old Testament. They didn't have what we call the New Testament. But if you have a look at Luke chapter 24 and verse 44, this is Jesus talking, and he says to them, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." And so Jesus and his disciples were familiar with the Hebrew Bible. And the Hebrew Bible contains all of the books of our Old Testament, but they are not in the same order. You will see from Luke 24:44 that Jesus makes this kind of 3-way division of the books: the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. And you will see on the screen now this division: the law, the prophets, and the writings. As I say, all the books are there, but they are in a different order. Genesis to Deuteronomy is the law, and then you've got the former prophets: Joshua, Judges, Samuel and Kings. And then you have the latter prophets. So we go from, just looking down the contents of my Old Testament, so going from Isaiah, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and then you've got the 12 smaller prophets from Hosea to Malachi. And then you have this section called the writings. It doesn't just include Psalms and Proverbs and Job, but it also includes some of these other books that you'll see there on the screen: Ruth, Esther. And interestingly, the Hebrew Bible ends with Chronicles. And so if you've ever read through your Bible in a year and you've got to the beginning of Chronicles and you thought, haven't I just read all of this in Kings? The answer is, well, yes, you have. But in the Hebrew Bible, the arrangement of the Hebrew Bible, Chronicles doesn't come straight after Kings. Kings is in the former prophets, and Chronicles comes right at the end. Now, if you want to know more about the arrangement of the Old Testament, or the arrangement of the Hebrew Bible, then I put a link below. If you're watching this on the YouTube page, in the notes below, there's a link to the Bible Project video which looks at this, and I'd recommend that. So turn over from the contents page of your Bible to Genesis chapter 1, and what we'll do is we'll just kind of flick through and we'll highlight the main points of the story as we summarize the Old Testament story from Genesis chapter 1 through to the end of 2 Kings, and we might go a little bit further. The story begins with creation, and the creation of the world, the universe, the creation of Adam and Eve. God places Adam and Eve in a garden, and they're free to eat everything except from the fruit from one tree. And the kind of the story is, are Adam and Eve going to submit and to trust God's definition of what is good and bad, or are they going to want to take the responsibility and the role of defining what is good and bad on themselves? And as the story unfolds, we see that is exactly what they do. They are cast out of the garden. We go through Cain, Abel, with the story progresses on to Noah and the flood. And by the end of Genesis chapter 11, things are in a pretty sorry state. People have generally chosen to rebel against God, that they've taken the responsibility for defining good and evil upon themselves. And then in Genesis chapter 12, we kind of start the story of God's solution to the problem of people. We need a new kind of person. And God calls this guy called Abram, who later becomes Abraham. And God chooses this man, chooses this family. He makes he makes a number of promises to Abraham, specifically in Genesis 12, Genesis 15, and Genesis 17. Amongst other things, God promises that Abraham will be the father of many nations. Kings will come out of his line. All nations will be blessed through him and through his descendants. At this point, Abraham and Sarah don't have and can't have any children. God also promises to give Abraham the land. And then, in terms of reading the story, starting at Genesis chapter 1, the Bible story is relatively straightforward to read until you get to about the middle of Exodus. And so, picking up kind of Abraham, the story of Abraham, eventually has a son, Isaac. Then you've got Abraham, Isaac. Isaac has a son, Jacob, and Jacob is an interesting character. Jacob, when you read the story, he will eventually has his name changed to Israel. He's the kind of the father of the nation of Israel. But the whole story of how he comes to end up with the children that he does is a really kind of fairly sorry affair. But Jacob ends up with 12 sons, and they will become the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. One of those sons is Joseph, as in Joseph and the Technicoloured Dreamcoat. But the rest of his brothers don't like Joseph. Joseph doesn't help his cause. He ends up, after, again, a fairly long story, he ends up in prison in Egypt. And then after a bit more, he ends up as the Prime Minister of Egypt. And there's a famine in that whole area. And because of Joseph, the whole of the area is saved from the devastating effects of the famine. But we get to the end of Genesis, and all of Joseph's family are now, so Jacob and his brothers and the rest of the family are now down in Egypt, where Joseph is the prime minister. We then turn over into the book of Exodus. Time has gone on. The rulers in Egypt no longer remember Joseph and all that he did, and instead they see this ever-increasing nation of Israel, and they see them as a threat, and so they oppress them, they make them their slaves. The people cry out, and eventually, after hundreds of years, God answers their cries and sends Moses. And then there is this whole story where Moses confronts Pharaoh. There are the plagues, and the people are eventually, through the events of the Passover, where the firstborn sons of all of Israel are killed. Moses leads the people out into the desert. They cross the Red Sea. Egypt's army is wiped out. And then in Exodus chapter 20 or Exodus chapter 19, they find their way to Mount Sinai. And here God again enters into a covenant, a promise relationship with the people, and he gives them the law, the 10 commandments, but also quite a lot of other laws, 613 laws altogether, about how they are to live, and he will be their God and they will be his people. So we're up to Exodus chapter 20. Now this is where it gets, when you're reading through, let's say, the Bible in a year, this is where it gets a little bit more challenging, in that the kind of the narrative part of the story has ended, and we get into pages and pages of regulations, building and planning details for the tabernacle, what the priests should wear, what they need to do, and all these laws, things you can and you cannot do. And so that kind of period where they're at Mount Sinai, God's given them the 10 commandments, that covers quite a bit of the rest of Exodus and some of the other bits. In there we've got the story of the golden calf. We won't mention that today. So then you've got Leviticus. It contains a whole load of laws and blessings and curses of what will happen if you do and you don't do what God has said. We come into the book of Numbers. Again, there's a bit of narrative in there, and so there are bits that are easier to read than others. God's promise to Abraham the land, and the people go from Mount Sinai through the desert and to the boundary, and they send out 12 spies to go and see the land. The spies come back, and Joshua and Caleb are the exception, but the other 10 all say the land is great, but there's no way we can go in there. The people are huge, the cities are fortified. Why has God brought us here just to be wiped out? And because of their grumblings, they spend the next 40 years wandering around the desert. And in that 40 years, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb, all of the other adults that rebelled at that point have died, and it's now their children who eventually find themselves at the end of Deuteronomy. They find themselves at the border of the promised land. And so then we move into the book of Joshua, and in Joshua is the story of how they take the land. And then we move into the book of Judges, and the book of Judges is kind of the story of a spiral and decline. So the people repeat this cycle. They rebel, they sin. God sends an oppressor to oppress them, bring them back to their senses. The people Once they're oppressed, they cry out to God. God sends a deliverer or a judge, and someone like Samson or Gideon, to mention two of them. And then the people, they come back to God. They're free once again, and then in their freedom they then sin and go after false gods, and the cycle just repeats itself again and again and again. So that's Judges. And then we move into the book of Samuel. God raises up and calls Samuel to minister before him, and the people of Israel, they ask God for a king. They're not happy with having God as their king. They want a king so that they can be just like everyone else. And God says, well, I'll give you a king. And he lays out in a few of the chapters, well, yes, I'll give you a king, but this is what they'll do. And so the first king is Saul, and then after him comes David and Solomon. So David and Solomon are probably the two greatest kings that Israel had, and their stories are told in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. And then into 1 Kings as well, we have Solomon as king, and then at the end of 1 Kings 11, the wheels start to fall off. Following Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam becomes king, but he isn't particularly wise. He oppresses the people, and the nation ends up splitting. And so you've got Israel in the north with 10 of the tribes, and Judah in the south with 2 of the tribes. And so you then got this divided kingdom, Israel and Judah. And then through the rest of 1 Kings and then into 2 Kings is this story, just kind of tracking how the kings do, how the nations do. The kings in Israel in the north, the kings in Judah in the south. You've got 2 prophets that we came across in 1 Kings. The main prophet in 1 Kings was Elijah. We briefly encountered Elisha, and as we get into 2 Kings, Elisha is going to take over from Elijah as the main prophet. 2 Kings covers about 300 years of history, and part of the purpose of 2 Kings is to simply help us to understand why the events at the end of 2 Kings happen. So at the end of 2 Kings, both Israel and Judah are taken into exile. Israel in the north gets taken into exile by the Assyrians in 722 BC, and Judah in the south gets taken into exile by Babylon in 586 BC. So by the end of 2 Kings, both the north and the south are in exile. Jerusalem is burned down, the city walls are destroyed, the temple is in a really bad way. Now, you then come across the book of Chronicles. As I say, in the Hebrew Bible, Chronicles comes at the end. It tells the same story, but from a slightly different perspective, and that's a whole another video on its own, I expect. History-wise, well, you've got the people. So the people from Judah have been taken off in 586 BC to Babylon, and that story kind of picks up kind of what happens next. Kind of picks up a bit in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, because after the exile, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah are the story of a few different groups of people coming back from the exile into Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and to rebuild the city. You then, if we just flick over in your Bible to the prophets, so we're now starting with Isaiah right through to the end of the Old Testament, as our Old Testament are all books, they're all prophecies, and these are prophets who were either prophets to the northern kingdom of Israel, or they were prophets to the southern kingdom of Judah. And so in terms of where these books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, etc., all the way through to Malachi, where they all fit in different places in the kind of the story of 1 Kings and 2 Kings. So you've got your kings across the top, and then at different places your prophets slot in. So for example, the book of Isaiah starts with the vision concerning Judah and Jerusalem. So we're talking about the southern kingdom that Isaiah son of Amos saw during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. And so when we locate where those kings are, and that's kind of where the context in which Isaiah was speaking. In fact, as we read through the book of 2 Kings, there are various points where the story with Isaiah overlaps in the telling of the story. And so, for example, in 2 Kings chapter 19, there is a quotation from one of Isaiah's prophecies as he is interacting there with Hezekiah in the particular context in which he finds himself. A few weeks ago, I sent out a WhatsApp and said if I was doing a summary of the whole of the Old Testament, which characters would you like to hear about? I think I've mentioned quite a lot of them already. So we talked about Joseph, Adam and Eve, Moses, and was helped by Aaron, King Saul, Noah we mentioned, Abraham and his wife Sarah. King David had a good friend Jonathan, and so their story, and so quite a lot of the Psalms were written by David, quite a lot of Proverbs were written by Solomon, and so some of that wisdom and poetry writing goes with that sort of time if you're trying to kind of work out where the different books go in the timeline. We mentioned Solomon, we mentioned Elisha, Elijah, and then there are, if you look at the Hebrew Bible table of contents, you've got these writings at the end which contain a kind of an interesting mix of different things. So you've got there people like Daniel, you've got people like Ruth and Esther, because they're kind of almost standalone stories. If you've got any other questions, obviously it's a very, very quick summary. If you've got any other questions, then do put them in the comments section down below on YouTube, and I will see if I can answer them there.